When the United Nations was created at the end of World War II, its aim was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. To back that goal up, it was agreed in 1946 that the UN needed a permanent, credible force to create conditions for peace and to resolve future conflicts effectively. But shortly thereafter, the Cold War began, and with the unique exception of the Korean conflict, for much of the following decade, the UN's peacekeeping role was limited to supervising such things as the ceasefires along the border of India-Pakistan, as well as in Palestine. October 1956 saw the birth of the UN Emergency Force, when Britain, France, and Israel unilaterally invaded Egypt's Sinai Peninsula.
Why should there be any suspicion?
Into this feverish situation came Lester Pearson, Canada's then Secretary of State for External Affairs. And during those heated discussions, he virtually invented the key principles of peacekeeping. Mr. Pearson recognized that the purpose of international peacekeeping wasn't just to halt a conflict, but to help resolve the underlying causes of tension through negotiation. Pearson later won the Nobel Prize for Peace for that, and secured for Canada a worldwide identification with both the concept of peacekeeping and its practice in the field. In fact, since 1947, tens of thousands of Canadian Forces members have taken part in over 30 peacekeeping missions for the United Nations and other international bodies. During that time, their activities ranged from reporting, such as on the UN Yemen Observer Mission in 1963-64, to the positioning of fully armed military units between disputing parties, as in Cyprus, to the 2,400-odd ground troops, sailors, and airmen deployed in the former Yugoslavia. Canada has been clearly aligned with the West throughout the post-World War II period, but since it has neither a history of colonialism nor territorial ambitions, its acceptance has been widespread. Other like-minded nations joined Canada in the early days of peacekeeping, including the Norwegians, Danes, Dutch, Australians and New Zealanders, and the Irish, as well as the British and French. In more recent years, the range of contributors has grown significantly to include the Pakistanis and Indians, a number of African nations, the United States, and former East Bloc countries. Canada's proud of its record, and based on that long experience, the Departments of External Affairs and National Defence have drawn up a list of 7 criteria to guide our government in deciding whether Canadian forces will participate in a new mission. First, the mission should have a clear and enforceable mandate, which may come from the United Nations or a group such as the Organization of American States. Second, the principal antagonists must agree to a ceasefire and to Canadian participation. Third, the arrangements should be likely to serve the cause of peace and, in the long term, lead to a political settlement. Fourth, the size and composition of the peacekeeping force, for instance its geographic balance, should be appropriate to the mission. Fifth, Canadian participation should not jeopardize other Canadian commitments. Sixth, there must be a single identifiable authority, like the UN, which is competent to lead the operation. And finally, seventh, Canada's participation must be adequately funded and logistically supported. One thing the past 45 years has demonstrated is that the best peacekeepers are well-trained military personnel. In the Canadian Forces, when there's an actual deployment, everyone on the mission goes through training upgrades in key military disciplines, from the combat personnel right through to the chaplains, padres, and medical staff. Much of this training takes place here at Camp Petawawa, Ontario. And while there's no distinct peacekeeper training course, because of the unpredictable nature of the assignments, Canadian Forces troops regularly rehearse for peacekeeping activities, sometimes in very rugged terrain around the world. A rehearsal may, for example, involve escorting a humanitarian aid convoy, which gets stopped in a roadblock, as often happened in Bosnia or Rwanda. The core training centers on conflict resolution, both interpersonal and tactical, but the exercise may also prepare personnel to deal with unfamiliar terrain and climates. Part of each training scenario will certainly cover local customs and cultures, where respect and foreknowledge are the keys. The training also emphasizes high degrees of personal self-control, patience, and self-discipline. Currently, that training is being put to the test by thousands of Canadian troops who are engaged in or committed to over 20 peacekeeping missions all around the world. Canadian Navy, Army, and Air Forces are all involved in peacekeeping missions. As well as the ground troops, so familiar from the evening news, there are naval forces on patrol in the Adriatic. They are Sea King helicopters supporting the UN arms blockade in the former Yugoslavia. Air Transport Group also plays a very active support role. The ATG C-130 Hercules has flown over 1,000 high-risk mercy trips into Sarajevo alone, on average 3 times a day, in a mission that has now run far longer than the famed Berlin airlift. A Canadian Herc was the only aircraft flying humanitarian aid into Kigali, Rwanda in the horrifying spring of 1994. All these personnel come under the command of National Defence Headquarters. Their normal costs are borne by Canada, though the UN often contributes to the mission's operating expenses. At the field level, they are under the operational control of the international commander, who may be someone like Sir General Michael Rose of the British Army, or senior Canadian officers like Major General Romeo Dallaire or Major General Louis Mackenzie. As any of these officers would tell you, there is a destabilization in the global environment. Events are happening very rapidly now. The lethality of armament and the danger to civilian populations is increasing. Since the Berlin Wall came down in 1990, there have been more new peacekeeping missions than there were in the prior 20 years. The concept of peacekeeping has grown to include the increasingly complex operations now required to rebuild peace in countries torn by civil war. In the future, peacekeeping will encompass all of its traditional roles, such as observation, escorting relief convoys, monitoring blockades, and overseeing elections. But it may also involve more missions with humanitarian and environmental concerns, as well as with conflict resolution in ethnic, nationalist, and religious disputes. It's been said that peacekeeping is no job for the military, but it's a job that only the military can do. Peacekeeping is a job not without risk. Over 100 members of the Canadian Forces have died while serving on duty. It's not an easy decision to expose Canadian military personnel to the possibility of injury and death to secure peace for people living in countries far away from ours. Yet the strategic implications are clear. Unless Canada and other nations continue to support the UN and continue to support peacekeeping, however defined, situations in many parts of the world will deteriorate to a point where a conflict may well escalate beyond national and regional boundaries. For the peacekeepers, the peace is never complete.